Today's video is all about capturing high-quality, low-light footage using the GoPro Hero 13 Black. Now, the GoPro Hero 13 Black does have a smaller sensor than some other competing action cameras, but the interesting thing is the Hero 13 Black can get just as good or better low-light footage as long as you're using the correct settings. So by the time you reach the end of this video today, you will know exactly how to get the very best low-light footage using your GoPro Hero 13. And by the way, if you hear any loud noises behind me, there's been some trees falling down. There's a lot of heavy snow and ice right now, and I just had a loud one crash behind me right before I started filming. So I made sure I'm out of reach of any of those. So if they do fall behind me, that can make for an extra interesting video. So in order to capture that quality low light footage, all you need is one piece of equipment, and that equipment is a gimbal. Now, I personally like the Hohem iSteady Pro 4, and that's because it's a very budget-friendly gimbal. This gimbal costs less than $100, and it's super easy to mount the GoPro on here. Let me demonstrate that really quick. So what you want to do is you want to get the mechanism right here, so the text is reading from up to down, and then you're just going to pop your camera on just like this, and then you're just going to pull this up and click the orange tab into place. And your GoPro is going to be mounted like this. This is how it's going to look on the front. And then on the back, it's going to look like this right here. And in my case, I have the USB pass-through door on here on the side. And the nice thing is the Hohem iSteady Pro 4, it will accommodate that as well. So you don't have to take it off. So it's really nice just to be able to leave it on there. And then as far as using the gimbal, right here's the power button, the red button right here. And all you have to do is hold it in to power it on. And you can see the GoPro stabilizes right there. There's no balancing to mess with on here. You just pop it on, put it into place, and the gimbal does the rest. And as far as the modes that I use, I like to use the PF mode most of the time. With the PF mode, your camera's going to glide from side to side with movements. But the other mode I use from time to time is the L mode. And if you use the L mode, you just toggle it here with the mode button. The L mode is basically going to hold your camera in place. It's not really going to move. It's going to stay really stable right there. I personally like the PF because I like my camera to glide around a little bit when I'm moving along, changing angles, as you can see in some of this footage here. But the L mode is great as well. And then of course, anytime you want your camera just to go back level again, just double tap this. If you change the angle at all, like this right here, double tap it, and it's going to go right back into place. So that brings me to the reason of why you need a gimbal. The reason you need a gimbal with low lighting is we want to have a shutter speed that's as slow as possible in low lighting, because a slower shutter speed is going to let in as much light as possible. But the problem with a slower shutter speed is hypersmooth, which is a form of electronic image stabilization. It won't work properly with those slower shutter speeds. And that's because those slower shutter speeds have quite a bit of motion blur in there. And hypersmooth, while it can still stabilize the footage, the motion blur doesn't go along with the stabilization. So each frame is stabilized, but it's not sharp enough to do it well. So what you're going to have in your footage is you're going to have ghosting and jitter. Hypersmooth really only works well in shutter speeds at about 1/200 or faster. And for low light, 1/200 is not going to let in a lot of light. Your footage is going to be very dark. So that's where this gimbal solves the problem, because this gimbal stabilizes the camera mechanically, and it prevents any of that shake and jitter that you'll get in the camera if you're just using it handheld, or if you're using it on a selfie stick, which doesn't have mechanical stabilization. So the next key for getting really good low light footage with the Hero 13 is knowing the proper settings. So I'm going to run through the settings that I use and highly recommend. And these are the same exact settings I use for all of the sample clips you see in today's video. You want to make sure your GoPro's on and in video mode, and then we're going to click on the advanced parameters over here. Now for the first setting here of 8:7, I like to do 8:7 because I can reframe later on and I have that extra vertical resolution to work with. But if you're not going to do that at all later on, then I recommend doing 16:9. And for resolution, we of course want to do 5.3K. 5.3K is 91% more pixels than 4K. And when you take that 5.3K footage and you export it as 4K, it looks extra good. Now for the frame rate, you want to do 24 or 30. And of course, if you're in another country, not in the United States, you would do 25 or 30. Now, the reason for these samples that I did 30 is there were a lot of holiday lights in here. And if I did 24 frames per second with a 1/48 shutter speed, there would have been a lot of flicker in those lights. But because I did a frame rate of 30, and then, as I'll show you in a moment, a shutter speed of 1/60, it prevented all of the flicker in those lights. So do keep that in mind. If you don't have holiday lights, I recommend doing 24 because that's going to give you a little bit extra shutter speed to work with to let a little more light into the camera, but it's not going to be a huge difference. And of course, if you're doing 8x7 5.3K, the only lens you have to choose from is wide. For hypersmooth, you're going to keep it on, and that's because we're using our gimbal, and the gimbal is going to provide that extra stabilization, so that hypersmooth is not a problem. For the capture settings, we're going to leave those alone, and just make sure your zoom is 1.0x. You don't want any zoom on this. The zoom is digital, and it's going to degrade the quality of your footage. For ProTune, bit depth we can't change. That's automatically 10-bit. For bitrate, make sure that's set to high. We want to get the very highest bitrate. That's going to give us the very best looking footage. And then for the next setting here of shutter, it's going to be set to auto by default, but you want to set this to 1/60. And of course, in the daytime, that's going to be very overexposed. If we were filming with these settings in the daytime, we would need an ND filter. I do have a video on best GoPro cinematic settings. I'll link to that above if you want to check it out. And then for EV comp, that's going to be grayed out as well. For white balance at nighttime, I recommend either 4000K or 3200K. 3200K is going to give a slightly cooler look to your footage. 4000K is going to be a little more neutral looking. I like the neutral look personally at nighttime, but if you want to do 3200K, feel free to set that if you want a bluer look. But do make sure you set a static value here. If you keep it set to auto, it's going to be switching your white balance constantly, and it's going to be very hard to get good looking footage later on. For the ISO min, you want to set that to 100, and the ISO max, you want to set that to 800. I have tested the GoPro before with an ISO max of 1600, and I find there's just too much noise and grain in there. But ISO 800 for max, it does get surprisingly good looking footage. The sharpness, you want to keep that at low. And then for the denoise, if you're going to do any denoising later on, you can keep your denoise set at low. But if you're going to depend on the GoPro for denoising, I recommend doing medium. I don't like to do high, as I find it can make the footage look extra soft and it can lose a lot of detail. But I find that medium does work well for the denoise. And by the way, this footage that I captured, I had denoise set to medium. I did not use any other plugins, and as you can see here, that footage came out really well. And then the audio settings down here, those do not apply to video. Depending on what you're filming, you may want to use the mics in here, or you may want to use an external mic. So now that you know how to use the gimbal and the settings you need to use, you are all set for getting the very best low light footage using the Hero 13 Black. For the rest of this video, I'm going to share a couple minutes of footage that I filmed with this for you to enjoy and for you to study and see just how well this does in low light with these settings.